You are listening to Radio Aula Mundi.
Hi there, wherever you are. I'm Marco Rixecker, a freelance writer, reporter, producer, teacher, translator, tour guide, poet, singer, and songwriter. I speak several languages, and I'm the creator and founder of Radio Aula Mundi, an evolving podcast station where no language and all languages are spoken. It's a multilingual mix of music, poetry, lectures, languages, interviews, documentaries, recipes, and a lot more, co-produced with the students of the Aula Mundi International Cultural Center. You can find us on radioaulamundi.bandcamp.com, podcasts.apple.com, Spotify, YouTube, Breaker, Player FM, Facebook. Search Radio Aula Mundi. The following narrative includes excerpts from a collection of testimonies and interviews entitled Let's Talk About It Anywhere in the World, where it is all about people's voices, accents, and speech patterns, hand in hand with my own personal anecdotes and observations. In addition to that, people are free to introduce themselves and speak their minds openly, in their respective, often indigenous languages and dialects, without any paraphrases or expectations. So, let the story go on from there. Something typical about Chicago is that it's only there that a Welshman would end up being one of the central figures of the local music scene. The name of Jon Langford is familiar to anyone who follows Chicago music, especially rock and roll, punk, folk, and country. Jon Langford is the founder and leader of the Mekons and the Waco brothers, two bands that almost stand at opposite ends of the musical spectrum. The Mekons were part of the first wave of British punk rock, before Jon Langford emigrated to Chicago. And the Waco brothers have always been associated with alt country, an alternative form of country music. So, Jon Langford was born and raised in Wales, but now he lives in Chicago, which he has chosen as a place to express his artistic freedom, especially as a visual artist. But music has never left him. He came to Chicago to work as a painter and has developed quite a reputation for his portraits, including those of some major rock stars such as Bob Dylan. Anyway, I decide to reach out, and I'm actually quite surprised when I see a quick response. Still, it takes a couple of loops and bounds until Jon Langford and I are able to connect from different places in the world. His background, his biography, the history of the Mekons and the Waco brothers, it will all come alive in his voice. But at the same time, he is going to insist that he doesn't dwell on the past too much. He doesn't have a self-centered mindset either, which is good, because other people's names will come up during our conversation, such as Woody Guthrie, Merle Haggard, Johnny Cash, Francisco Goya, and Bob Dylan. And when I mention the names of some of the people I've interviewed and whose broader question or questions I repeat to Jon Langford, he even writes them down, reflecting his insatiable curiosity. And early on, I noticed that Jon Langford is a great storyteller.
My name's Jon Langford. I'm originally from Wales, South Wales, industrial town called Newport, dock town. Wanted to be an art student when I was like 16, 17, 18, and finally left town, went to art school in Leeds, and immediately became a punk rocker. with the band the Mekons, and we had some adventures on various levels of success. And after about 15 years of that, I moved to America, where I found Chicago as a great place, a very supportive place for my work there. And when I moved to Chicago, I started making visual art again because I thought the punk rock thing was pretty much done. But Chicago had different ideas, and I got sort of sucked up into a whole lot of other musical activity, which I wasn't really expecting. But now it's too late to stop any of it. So I still play live a lot with various projects. The Mekons have been a bit quiet because we toured. I guess we were lucky on one level because we toured right before the pandemic, big tour in Europe, and a new album came out, and then a big tour in America. And then immediately the pandemic kind of shut everything down. We made an album during the pandemic remotely. And last year we went to Valencia in Spain and recorded another new album, which will come out in 2024. Hopefully we'll be able to start playing again then as well. But I have a band in Chicago called the Waco Brothers that's been going for a really long time as well. And we put out a new album this year. We were very connected with a label called Bloodshot, which sort of disintegrated a few years ago. So we lost our drummer. Joe Camarillo was a really important part of the band. So we were in a kind of doldrums, and we waited till last spring, and we started recording a new album. So that just came out this spring. It's called The Men That God Forgot by the Waco Brothers. So I've been touring a lot with that, and I do a lot of kind of guerrilla art music events where I go and I have my artwork with me, and I go and play songs and tell stories. Basically, there seems to be a kind of demand now for. A lot of people are very interested in the past. I'm not that interested in the past, so I do seem to do quite a lot of things about talking about what it was like in 1978 and things like that. But I'm trying to keep things kind of more future orientated. So,
What are you working on right now?
I've been doing a series of singles for a label in Valencia, Spain, called the label's called Tiny Global Productions, and it's a guy called John Henderson who used to be based in Chicago, and then he was based in Budapest, and he works with bands like the Nightingales and Martin Brahma from The Fall, who are all people I've known for a long time. And when the pandemic reared its ugly head, he invited me to go into the studio and start making singles. And to be honest, it was a great opportunity to start making some music. I think it was before the pandemic we actually discussed it, and then it was wonderful to have a project that I could get on with and form small pods with different musicians. And the idea was that sometimes, making a whole album is kind of cumbersome. You can have a very fresh and interesting kind of collaboration with some people, but then it's like, well, what's it going to be? But there has to be an album, and you have to kind of stretch it out to maybe sometimes those don't make the best work. And to be able to be really fast on your feet and make singles, 7-inch singles, which I always loved. That was my initial entry into music was buying 7-inch singles back in the early 70s in England. And punk was very much about that as well. The 7-inch single with the picture sleeve was very sort of fetishistic object for punk rockers. It was really cool. You just get 2 songs by your favorite band, and that was kind of enough. And there was more of an immediacy to it than pondering over what would make a full album. So I've got I've done 9 so far. And it's on the brink of releasing another 3. So we're just going to keep going. They're limited editions. They're very expensive. They don't make any money. I'm assured that it's just good art and good karma. So people buy them mail order from Tiny Global, and we sell out pretty quickly. But I think the plan will be to do something further with that in the end, and to make an album. But what it means is that the the songs on the album don't have any sort of consistent sound. They're kind of going all over the map, and it's quite enjoyable to me. And then it's interesting that these things are done in kind of isolation with different people. Then when you put them together, there's quite jarring juxtapositions, which I quite enjoy. So,
how musical do you feel today?
Or me right today? That's a very I was actually I'm going to do some singing this evening, some backing vocals. When my son's got the basement kitted out as a recording studio, and I'm going to go down there and sing some backing vocals I did in Wales a couple of months ago, very late at night when I'd had too many drinks, and they don't sound very good. So I'm going to redo them, make them sound more angelic. Perfect. But I have a project in Wales as well called the Men of Gwent, and there's a label called Country Mile Records. So we worked throughout the pandemic writing songs kind of via the internet, and so we've got songs that have been waiting to be recorded from about 4 years ago now. It's been pretty interesting, and we went to a very remote sheep farm in the middle of Wales, a bit of Wales I'd never even been to, and it's now a recording studio, an old stone building, and we stayed there for 5 days and recorded. But that's with all musicians from my hometown that I've been working with. Again, I've worked with for 20, 30 years, so, but for me, that keeps an important connection with where I grew up, and that's a really nice thing to have.
So, right after introductions, my first couple of questions are meant to identify Jon Langford as a musician. And it is clear that he is still a punk. He will always be a punk, no matter where he lives and what he does. It stands for his artistic freedom, living in a city like Chicago, that has a lot more musical diversity than the stereotypes generally attached to it. Which part of you is Chicago, and which part of you is your home country?
That's a good question, because when I first moved to Chicago, the first thing I did was write about 15 songs that seemed to all be about Wales. So it took me quite a long time, but I'd never really thought about having a solo career or anything like that. I like to collaborate with music. I like to write songs with the Mekons. We write all the songs together. With the Waco brothers, it's, there's a sort of, I don't know, it's just there's more of a kind of like, not a formula exactly, but there's the kind of way that the Waco brothers work, and that's, I don't know. I started writing songs, and they definitely wouldn't fit with the Waco brothers, and they definitely wouldn't fit for the Mekons. So I was and I looked at them all, and these are all about my hometown. So, and that project from that first album, Skull Orchard, that has kind of continued to some extent with the Men of Gwent, where we basically write songs about a very, very small and limited geographical area, but it's rich with history, and it's kind of like the closer you tune in the microscope, the more interesting it gets. So,
as part of my conversation with Jon Langford, I also include a question coming from an international student. It triggers a longer conversation about visual arts and music, as well as the connections we can make between the two. What do you and Bob Dylan have in common?
Wow. We're old white guys, and he's older than me. I have to say, I think Bob Dylan's fantastic. I think for someone of his stature and influence and creative output to have not become a safely commodified entity at this stage in his career is pretty heroic. So many other people just kind of like in the show business world of the music business, people just can settle back and live off their past reputations and do their greatest hits. And forget about moving forward. And I think that's impossible for Bob Dylan. So I'm not comparing myself to Bob Dylan, but I would definitely say that I share, or I aspire to the way he's run his career in a way. I love the way people still sort of frightened of him. He's not a safe bet, and you never quite know what he's going to do. And it's good. It's good, and he clearly doesn't mind that. And I think there's something very playful about the way he manipulates the idea of a career as well.
Isn't unpredictability something that makes art worthwhile?
I've always thought with the Mekons that we didn't necessarily have a sound. You know, people say, what do Mekons sound like? I said, well, it could sound like anything we want it to sound like. And over the sort of 43 years of doing the Mekons, it's kind of ridiculous, the places we've gone sonically. But what tethers it together, as I was saying before, was that idea of the principles or the kind of founding kind of moments of what got us into it in the first place with punk rock. There was it was kind of like a light bulb going off, and there was a lot of ideas that we've stuck with. And those ideas are that maybe it's not the pursuit of money that's the most important thing. Maybe it's the way you work and not what you sound like. Maybe there's a sort of ethical element to it. Maybe it's maybe it doesn't really even matter what you sound like. Maybe it's, I don't know, getting a bit carried away there. But I mean, we've always tried to make stuff that's interesting, but we've always tried to interest ourselves and hope other people would come along with it. So it would be very boring for us to. I mean, in a sense, Sally Timms from the Mekons always says the reason for our success is our lack of success, because possibly if we'd had really big hits, there would have been pressure on us to keep repeating that formula. And to be honest, we've only ever really existed on the fringes, and that's an incredible freedom to go and do and work in ways. And we are interested in the process of how the thing is made and ways of tinkering with that. So we'll often talk, before we've even played a note, we'll often talk about approaches and ways to generate songs and make music, and the way we want to do it and the way we want to make it different from the previous time. And I think that's what makes the Mekons interesting for me. And yeah, it is unpredictable, and sometimes it's not all to everyone's taste, but that's okay as well.
How visual is your music?
How visual is it? I would say with the solo stuff, a lot of the and some of the Waco Brothers material, the way I generate that stuff, it goes back and forwards from the paintings to the songs very much. It's a lot of cross-pollination. There's things that I can see visually that would work for a painting for me, because I always include text in the paintings. And so sometimes it's like chicken and the egg. I can't even remember which came first. Did the song come first, or did the painting come first? But a lot of times I'll just be working on a painting and I'll be feeling something and put lines into it, and then I'll expand on that in a song. Or I like the idea of songwriting.
When are you going to paint your masterpiece?
Maybe I have, but yeah, the streets of Rome paved with rubble. That's a good song. I take solace from the fact that someone like Francisco Goya did his black paintings during his 70s. So I feel like there's no pressure here, For me, that's his masterpiece. And then you mentioned, like you say, you mentioned him and you mentioned Bob Dylan. I mentioned Goya, you mentioned Bob Dylan. I think there's some interesting parallels there as sort of people I might feel mentored by, you know. Goya was, Bob Dylan could have been just a big pop star. Goya could have just been the court painter, but there was something inside him driving him to explore different territory, and possibly it was what was going on in the world around him. In fact, possibly, definitely, it was what was going on in the world around him and things that happened to them. So yeah, no, that's my plan. You know, I'm going to get up on my 78th birthday. I'm going to paint my masterpiece.
My question for Jon Langford about when he is going to paint his masterpiece is taken from a Bob Dylan song entitled "When I Paint My Masterpiece." And the connection between visual arts and music continues. As part of my conversations with people, I often have them ask questions, either specifically for someone I know I'm going to chat with in the near future, or broadly for anyone I might speak with anytime, anywhere in the world. And the first question for Jon Langford comes from Karen Harriman, a poet based in Los Angeles. And she wants to know,
how would you describe your music as a painting? Or if your music were a painting, what would it look like?
How would you describe your music as a painting? Well, there's interesting things in a discussion like that, because I've always kind of like bent reality a little bit to make sense of the fact that I think paintings and songs come from the same place in my brain, but you perceive a song and a painting slightly differently. A song actually has to unveil itself in real time. So maybe my songs wouldn't really look like a painting, but it might look like a very short animated film. But yeah, but I think the idea of a song, there is a sort of start and a middle and maybe an end. I don't know, but with a painting, I try to guide people around, but yeah, that's a really puzzling question. It pokes a big hole in the core argument of my, practice. So I've done paintings which I think describe what the song looks like to me, but you know what? You put the painting and the song together. It's not that it doesn't really matter what the song would look like to me. It's what it paints to someone else. It's part of the conversation. So someone else might be perceiving something entirely different. I've always been kind of conscious of that with songs, that I like the idea that they can be a little bit open-ended, and people, you don't kind of like nail everything down. So this means this means that. People often say, what does that song mean? And so, what does it mean to you? And likewise with the paintings. I always thought it was kind of funny when Pablo Picasso described Guernica in an interview in the 1930s. And he said, the bull is fascism, the horse is Spain, blah, 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 blah. Then he did the same interview in the 1950s and everything had changed. It was the horse was fascism and the bull was Spain. So there's no need, I think you can see some of my song paintings, and that's kind of to the best of my ability. I'm trying to make the song into a painting. And this means that it actually contains lyrics. So in the painting, if you're going to read the words, it does create that kind of journey of time a little bit in a kind of fairly mundane sense. It's not like, yeah, I think of songs as kind of short films that unveil themselves. So a painting But I do love painting, and I do like certain. I'm more of an illustrator than a painter, and my reliance on text is also possibly, it could be something that could be described as a weakness, possibly. That I can't get what I'm saying over without putting a load of text in it. But I'm also think in another life I may have been a sign writer doing the signs outside supermarkets, so putting the prices up, because I really love doing text and lettering. So that's something, and I like the way it works within the paintings, and I think it makes the paintings just resonate on a different level. So.
Jon Langford's hometown, Chicago, is also known for its public art and the ways people interact with it, which makes me curious about some of the practical aspects of artistic expressions and creations. When you look at the Chicago Picasso, what does it look like to you?
I kind of like it, and I think it was horrifying to the people here when it arrived. But I don't know. There's a lot of Chicago's obviously had a lot of money at some point, and they decided to splash out on this. There's a Dubuffet. I forget what's the other one. It's not Kandinsky, something else. There's a bunch of public art that's really quite impressive, to be honest. I like the Picasso. It's been here the whole time I've been here. And when I look at it, I don't even think of Pablo Picasso. I just think there's that thing that's there. It feels incredibly permanent and almost outside of any. It's just a thing that's there in public, and it doesn't even feel like art. Almost, it's just this weird object.
How practical should art be in everyday life?
Practical. I don't know if it needs to be exactly practical, but for me, art and music need to collide with everyday life. So, and what I worked out sort of while not listening particularly at art school was the art that I liked and the art that made sense to me was stuff that related to everyday experience. And that's probably why I became a big country music fan. That sort of honky-tonk music of people like Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash, Hank Williams. They dealt with everyday things, but with a kind of like poetic, almost political, small p political maybe take on it. I loved Goya, and I realized what Goya was painting about as his career progressed was his fears and his experiences in the world. It was like he wasn't making escapist art. The music, I like punk rock because I felt it dealt with the realities. It was a conversation about the realities of what we were facing at that particular moment in history. I didn't like the music that came before it because I thought it was virtuosity with shit lyrics about elves and wizards, and it didn't make any sense to me. I didn't know any elves or any wizards, and wasn't interested in anything like that. It was almost like escapist music, or music that was born of a sort of hierarchy of virtuosity and technique and vacuous in terms of this content. And I loved reggae music because I saw that as passionate, need to attack the people's enemies, So
how practical should art be?
How practical? I cannot remember my train of thought now, but I think I was I think what I was thinking about was I don't know how practical it is, but for me, the art that interests me is stuff that maybe is practical. Maybe it's something that provides a tool that kind of helps you communicate with other people and interpret the world. Maybe that's practical, isn't it? I think so.
So, Chicago is a thriving city where things change all the time. And people like Jon Langford keep changing along. What do you do to stay in the loop?
Ah. Um, sometimes I find Chicago big and frightening. It has a habit of offering me an olive branch every now and then. You know, when I fall out of love with Chicago, it kind of comes and does something nice for me, or makes me feel like I belong here. So it's hard to describe, but it does. There's a lot of support from people for what I do in this town. I wouldn't have been able to do much of it without that support. But it's hard, you know, when you're an artist, stroke musician, trying to earn a living, trying to keep house and home together. You know, it's feast and famine sometimes. But for me, Chicago has been a reliable friend. You know, so.
What is the coolest sound you've heard recently, and how could you play it on a musical instrument?
The coolest sound I've heard recently. I watched a documentary. I went to a play yesterday about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, which a friend of mine was in, and she was absolutely fantastic in it, Bethany Thomas. And I came home and realized I know the records, but I didn't know enough about her life story. So I watched a BBC documentary about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and I realized that she was playing she kind of invented rock guitar in about 1940. It's it's pretty great that this black woman was so far ahead of the game. You know, people like Eric Clapton pick up the accolades years later. It's kind of so silly, really, but to put a sound into a painting, it's hard. I think there's a lot of I have what I've always described as abstract elements in my paintings, and the music I like is not smooth music. It's not necessarily. I think it's layered, and it can be dissonant, and it can be kind of spiky, and I think that's something parallels that with the paintings. There's no direct kind of like correlation, but in my paintings there's a feel of, and there's also a feel of kind of like history in it as well. And I like music that sounds like it could be from ancient times as well as right from now. I think a lot of music capture when stuff that really haunts me, and the stuff that I think is really good when you hear something that's timeless. It could be from many different times. Sometimes I kind of sing things. I sing into my phone a lot now. I record into my phone a lot, and it's like little half idea things that, you know, just something that, yeah, does get stuck in your head. Earworms and phrases and things I pick up from daily life. I like to sit in there's a pub called the Murringer in Newport, and I like to go in there on my own. They play no music in there. There's no music allowed. And in the afternoon, there's loads of old guys just talking with that harsh Newport accent and having sort of drunken philosophical conversations, which I like to overhear. And sometimes lots of songs get born very easily in those situations, you know, or a phrase will, you know, and a phrase will go into my head. Maybe I don't write it down, but it'll keep coming back, until I do something with it. That's kind of a way of it earns its place.
There is more to a song than just a melody. It can also be a story. And there are quite a few songwriters who would use simple words and weave together a story or deliver a message, including Jon Langford. How much of a storyteller are you?
I think that's, like I said before, I like the idea that it's part of a conversation. I don't want to be in control of it to the point where I write a story where everything's, this means that, this happens then. I like things that are slightly veiled, slightly mysterious, and maybe have some sort of universalism so people can put their own meanings into it, and it strikes a chord with people. So it's not necessarily too specific. And I like the form of songwriting, like the repetition, the way you can emphasize things, repeat things, and certain phrases that may sound mundane on their own, by putting them to music and putting them in with certain sounds around them. It gives them this something, makes them quite, profound. So,
what about Woody Guthrie?
Well, again, Woody Guthrie's someone who's, he's making practical, functional art, isn't he? We talked about, is something practical. His folk songs are overtly political and overtly, a lot of the time, calls to action or pertinent finger pointing. Yeah, I mean, again, that tradition, but where does that tradition start? Where did Woody Guthrie get it from? I think what bothers me the most sort of with these days is this recent notions of like ownership of certain sounds that, people somehow own. You talk about someone like Merle Haggard, someone like Johnny Cash. In a lot of cases, they're taking the baton from someone else. In Merle Haggard's case, he's taking the baton from Lefty Frizzell and running with it for a bit, then passing it on to other people. It's the idea that it's all about individuals. I see it more of a, like I said, some kind of a formless, moving thing. This thing that is human culture is, we're separated by language. A lot of times music is wonderful because that crosses a lot of those borders. What I was working on in the studio the other day was a song about, I wrote with a friend of mine, Charles Curry, and it's called Hungry for Land Under Your Feet, and it features the recording we made. It's got Dave Alvin, Jimmy Dale Gilmore, me, and Bethany Thomas, who I mentioned earlier. But we did a Spanish language version of it as well, because basically the song's about refugees, it's about immigration, it's about illegal immigration, it's about border walls, it's about enclosures, people feeling they need to own land and control land and take land from other people. So the song's called Hungry for Land Under My Feet, but I was very conscious I wanted to do it in Spanish as well, and I wanted it to be sung by a Latina, and Rosie Flores was because become a good friend over the years, but long before I knew her, she was the first ever Latina on the country charts in 1985 or 86, I think. And she does a fantastic job, and she took this song to her Spanish teacher. We got the words translated. Then she worked and worked and worked to get the phrasing exactly right and the pronunciation exactly right. It's pretty great. So, that's just an example, and it's a song about something that's right in your face all the time. So that's the area I see myself working in. Woody Guthrie, he did exactly that. Pissed a lot of people off, you know.
Yeah.
That's got to be the in a country like America at the moment. You got to be pissing people off and hopefully bringing people in and communicating with people. There's a big outrage at the moment about this guy Jason Aldean has written this song. Like, have you heard that song? It's a country hit, and he made a very tasteless video outside the last courthouse where there was a lynching. And it's basically a song which sort of threatens vigilante justice. It's called Try That in a Small Town. And it's about big city folks being kind of decadent and getting away with it because they live in the big city. But if they came to his town, you know, we'd basically string you up. And it's such a kind of coded, it's not even that coded, but it's such a sort of like money grab for the current climate in America. It's exploiting that kind of political division that's going on right now. And it's kind of the theme song for that kind of city hating intolerance that America kind of currently seems to be.
When will we ever learn?
Yeah, what's it say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it just rhymes. Somebody said. I like that. There's a line in a Mekons song that I like as well, which is I think we stole it off a friend of ours called Terry Atkinson. It says, "History has a stutter. It says, watch out."
The next question for Jon Langford, coming from someone else, has to do with something that inspires artists for the better and for the worse. And it comes from a fellow Chicago artist who knows all about human suffering. Her name is Zara Baker. She's a musician, songwriter, and educator who has worked at the Chicago Old Town School of Folk Music.
The question is, what contribution through your art form can be made to eliminate suffering?
On a very practical level, we've always tried to use the music to be actively involved in political campaigns. So there's a whole history that goes right back. 1984, we were trying to raise money for miners' families to stop them being starved back to work. We did a lot of stuff with the anti-death penalty campaign. We worked with the campaign to get them a moratorium on it, then to get it abolished. Put out a bunch of albums, basically just to raise money, basically for the people who did the hard work to be able to afford their photocopying and phone bills and stuff like that. There were some nice things on those albums, but it wasn't the albums that sorted the problem out. It was the hard work of the people we were trying to fund. Currently, the next benefit show I'm involved in is got two projects I'm working on at the moment. One is to fund trying to raise money and awareness about medical research into artificial kidneys, which is a personal thing because our friend of ours needs one, and it's kind of stalled at the moment, but they're making these amazing artificial kidneys and people just need to know about it, and it would save a lot of lives. And on a very micro level, we're doing a concert to pay the rent of a refugee in town. So,
Eventually, Jon Langford and I have time to end the conversation with a poetry reading performance I ask him to do as an illustration for our talk. It is an obvious classic, an excerpt from A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas, which I tried to send him in a file, but I struggle a little bit with it due to technical issues. So he suggests that he get up and pick up a copy of the book, which he has on a shelf in his Chicago home. And it feels like a privilege to see Jon Langford sit down in his armchair with a beautifully illustrated book on his lap, reading an excerpt from A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas, breathing life into the lyrics with his rough voice and melodious Welsh accent. It will lead to a final question about the way Jon Langford associates with this literary classic. And the story goes on from there.
I'm Jon Langford, and I'm going to read the first two paragraphs of A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas, because I'm Welsh and Dylan was Welsh. One Christmas was so much like another in those years around the Seatown corner, now and out of all sound except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep, that I can never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. All the Christmases rolled down towards the two-tongued sea, like a cold and headlong moon bundling down the sky that was our street. And they stop at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves, and I plunge my hands into the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea, and out come Mrs. Prothero and the firemen.
When your hand goes in, what comes out?
When my hand goes in, what comes out? I have very warm memories of Christmas in South Wales. I love Child's Christmas in Wales because it's written 60 years before my childhood. Or it's about the time. That's a lot, but it seems very familiar. It seems like the Christmas. I think time moves a lot slower in those days. And I think to my children, they wouldn't understand it particularly. But for me, what Dylan Thomas was writing about, the gap between, that gap was a lot softer. And just that idea, that kind of lazy, bored, sort of people sitting around the house eating, falling asleep and farting and drinking. That's, that's what my Christmases were like. And it did used to, and if it did snow, it was magical. And now I live in Chicago, and if it snows, it's just a drag. Because I'm an old cynic.